for quite some time. So I'm glad we're finally able to make it happen. Just a little bit about myself. AgResource Consulting, well, I started doing this back in '84, so this is my 37th year. And I've always been interested in soil testing. And I started out with a little Lamont soil testing kit way back then, and eventually moved into the more regional extracts by probably the mid to late '80s. Became a certified laboratory in the early '90s. We're a laboratory certified for soils and manure. We never really envisioned ourselves as a commercial laboratory, but primarily just a laboratory to do the testing for the farm clients that we were dealing with. I mean, I always felt that if you really want to learn about soil, spend half your time in the lab and half your time in the field, and you can really put things together and see it with a much different perspective, particularly working with the soil testing system, the different extract solutions that you work with, in how they work, what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, and just exactly what they're good at predicting, and in some cases, what they're not good at predicting. So we moved on, just kind of going through some of your questions here, May. We probably started working with organic farmers in the late '80s. And then in the '90s, it really came on when Japan got in the soybean market. And it kind of correlated at the same time the first round of CRP came out. So all that land was certified organic, or potentially. And so there was a huge growth, and spent a lot of time up and down the Red River Valley working with farmers, transitioning anywhere from, 200-300 acre farms to 3,000 plus acre farms up there. And so in most of the '90s, I spent my time working with different certification committees, developing organic standards. That was just when the NOP was just really starting to get going, or being defined, I should say. And so did organic inspector trainings. I was utilized a lot, just talking about organic cropping and for fertility systems. So then eventually got more working with NRCS. We're technical service providers, so we do nutrient management plans, CAP 138 organic conversion plans. So right now, as of the last at least 10 years, the vast majority of what we do is working with farms that are certified organic. And that is enough to keep me busy. I do some fertility work occasionally for conventional farmers, which in a lot of ways is easier than organic. And so, but most of our emphasis is on organic farmers, organic production systems, from fertility to weed control, developing cropping systems to minimize weed pressures, disease pressures, insect pressures, just the whole system. So it's a little background there. So where do you think? Should I start with put some slides up, or do you have some other questions as I get in?
Well, I was just going to ask, kind of for more context, with a lot of the organic growers you're working with, have they been certified for a long time, or are you working with some growers that are a little bit more new to this?
All across the board. I probably have some clients that have been with me for over 20 years, and it seems they're always picking up. There's always more interest every year, so we're picking up new clients every year. Some farmers are retiring, passing it on to the younger generation, and sometimes the younger generation, they just look to use part of their old man's program and they want to do something different. So there's always a little bit of that, interestingly enough. But for the most part, the client base that I work with has been very long term.
So my burning question for follow-up there is, are the growers that have been doing organic production for 10 plus years, do they have a lot different struggles than folks that are newer to it, or are the struggles pretty universal?
Yes and no. I think the basic things are always a challenge, and that is being able to get the work done that you need to do, and the weather needs to cooperate. So, but as farmers get is more up to date from what they need, just becomes more routine. And sometimes it gets to a point where it becomes so routine. They got the rotation set up. They got the amount of nutrients coming in at different parts of the rotation, and so it's so routine that sometimes there's really not that much for me to do with them anymore. And so sometimes they'll just scale back, and I'll just do the soil testing, for them, and or if they, sign up for an NRCS program that needs a TSP input, I'll work with that. But in some cases, it's just that once you get these systems set up, they just go like clockwork, and they become very low maintenance accounts, put it that way.
Well, and just from our conversations in the past, when you say, getting their system set up, like what you really mean is like they've figured out what long rotation works for them, because that's really kind of a bedrock of your philosophy, is lengthening the rotation, right?
Yeah, very much so, because it's bringing diversity into the farming system, and what that means is, you've got your legume crops, you've got your grass crops, your non-legume crops. You're alternating that. You're just setting that rotation up so that you're lessening any pest pressures that you have. Some of those that you can work a rotation around, some of those you can't. Like some years you get armyworm that just comes in from nowhere, or aphids. That's not rotation dependent. But a lot of the things are. And so you develop these farming systems so that, I look at it like this. I look at conventional agriculture, that's reactive farming, where organic agriculture is proactive. And what I mean by that is you have to look at, these are the crops you want to raise. These are going to be the nutrient requirements for these crops. These are going to be the pest and disease issues of these crops. And so therefore, you develop that farming system to minimize those potential problems, so that you don't have to rely on herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, whatever side. And once you have that in place, you have to anticipate the problem and then work a system around it so that you're not going to have those problems. It'll be very minimal. You start with that. Oftentimes you have farmers that will come into organic production, and what determines the rotation is the markets. And so I can get, corn is generally good, soybean is generally good, wheat kind of comes and goes, the other small grains probably the same or worse. And after a while, what you find is that you get into let's say 3, 4, 5 years, the pest issues, particularly weed control, get so bad that they have to change their rotation to accommodate the weed pressures. And if they were to start that way to begin with, they'd have been better off, because that could be a really tough 3 to 5 year mental transition to make. Because you're not only transitioning the land, you're transitioning your thought processes. And that's what I get concerned about with, if you got somebody with a real conventional mindset, like, wow, $10 corn, why isn't everybody doing this? Well, it's not $10 anymore. And I had a farmer that called me up with that exact same question. And he says, well, why don't you come in my office? We'll spend 2 hours telling you why everybody doesn't do this. And we just gave him a real broad outlook. These are the problems you're going to face. I have this just tongue-in-cheek thing I always tell farmers when they approach me about organic farming, is that if I can't talk you out of it, you might be committed enough to make it work. And so you got to be really upfront with them. This is, you want to let them know what they're getting into, so there aren't any surprises. And yeah, it can be very functional. I've got some extremely profitable organic farmers that I work with that they just hum right along, and you drive by their fields and you can't tell they're organic, not by their weed control. The crops look good. The yields, this is Minnesota yields, so we're talking 200, 225 bushels per acre, like some of these guys are getting. And some of their neighbors, and they may not even know that they're organic. And what we're seeing as we move ahead, with all this herbicide resistant weed issues, is that, the conventional farmers are some of them are starting to look weedier than the organic farmers. So I'm telling farmers, don't be surprised in the next 5 years, you got conventional farmers driving up your road looking for advice on how to control weeds. And we're starting to see some of that already. Which goes into bigger question. You have a conventional farmer against the organic farmer. They look at them as being, backward, and, they don't want to adopt technology. But their system, they've got their challenges too. They're starting to fall apart, particularly with herbicide resistant issues. So they're going to have to start, whether they want to or not, willing to admit it or not, they're going to have to start adopting the practices, some practices that organic farmers never abandoned. So yeah, we're in kind of a transition right now, whether it's to organic or not. So,
well, we're at the point in the discussion where we arrived yesterday where I brought up the phrase post-chemical revolution.
Yeah, maybe I haven't heard that before, so I'll credit you with that one.
Yeah, I made it up, I swear. Well, we got hot out of the gate here. Why don't we bring your PowerPoint up here and stay on topic as much as we can.
Okay, so I just got I put a presentation together for an organic certification agency for their inspectors about just some principles about, what's involved in a fertility program. So I've kind of adopted some of this, and I'm just going to breeze through this and stick with whatever's pertinent. Anyway, this is my contact information. I can't get this thing to move. Okay,
you gotta click it on your screen sometimes, or it's just slow because it's
I just gotta use my mouse. Okay. Covered a lot of this. We're at MDA, which is Minnesota Department of Agriculture. We're certified. We test soil and manure, mostly with the farmers we grow, farmers that come in off the street. And also there's a few of the local co-ops that utilize this as well. We're not a huge lab. We never intended to be. But it's just, we manage things at a comfortable pace. Certified crop advisor, myself and both Joanne in this office are that. I am a technical service provider. I do nutrient management, pest management, and CAP 138, which is organic conversion plans for NRCS. And our primary focus is, one of the things we could talk about, why did I ever get into organic, is because I always had a very, very strong interest in nutrient management planning. And that really fits in with organic because it's all about, putting together a cropping system, the crop rotations, where you put these natural inputs, such as manure or the approved organic inputs. And it's just a whole big picture, of a very, a holistic approach. So that's how we segued into organic, because it's such an important part. Okay, so let's talk about soil tests. How are soil tests used? And it's quite a spectrum, but essentially, just to wrap it up, soil tests basically can be used as a tool to sell crop inputs, determine how much fertilizers and soil amendments should be applied, or soil tests can be used to monitor nutrient cycling, nutrient availability in soil, better assess the need for added fertilizer and soil amendments to achieve optimum plant growth, quality, and yield. Obviously, I kind of pertain more to the second. It's not to say anything bad about the people that are in the ag input industry. I mean, they're invaluable because we have to go someplace to get those inputs, or basically, it wouldn't work for me as an independent crop consulting either company. But anyway, we tend to look at the latter. You're looking at those soil tests. We're kind of mandated to do soil tests every roughly 3 years at a minimum, maybe going out to 4. I mean, if you're, if you're a livestock producer in Minnesota, you got a feedlot permit, and as part of that, you need to maintain a nutrient management plan, which means that you need to keep your manure tests and your soil tests updated within about 3 years or so. So when it comes to fertilizer recommendations, this is a big topic. I think that there's so much going on right now with the soil health movement, and that one soil test is better than the other. And I would say a better way to look at it is there's some soil tests are more or less appropriate depending upon the region that you're in. And so, but there seems to be this movement that everybody's saying, well, the reason we've got hypoxia issues and the reason we've got nitrates in the groundwater, phosphorus in the surface water, and all these environmental concerns, it's bad soil testing. It's not. It's the soil test interpretation that's the problem, much more so than the soil tests themselves. So basically, you've got 3 approaches to fertilizer recommendations. The crop removal system is probably what's utilized, at least in theory, by most of your ag input supply, fertilizer dealers, co-ops. A lot of the laboratories will make their recommendations based on some version of crop removal, because the idea is that we want to make sure your nutrient levels are high enough so that that nothing slips through the cracks, and so therefore just to make sure you've got enough. And some take it to extremes, some are quite reasonable with it, so it's pretty broad spectrum across the board. Then you've got your base cation saturation ratio system. That was really made popular. It was started by a guy named Bear out on the East Coast. It was picked up by McLean, who developed it and fine-tuned it in the state of Missouri. Then Dr. William Albrecht came in after that, and that was the system that was already in place when he began his career. He made some refinements to it and did a lot of focusing on calcium and the importance that calcium had with legumes, nutrient density in crops, in the feed value, and also the importance of calcium had on improving legume ability to fix nitrogen, things of that nature. But most of his research was in flower pots and greenhouses. Then after that, there was a guy who was a grad student of his by the name of McLean, who eventually wound up in Ohio, and he took Albrecht principles and tried to apply them to field scale. And he didn't have much success with that because it really wasn't making as much sense as it did in the greenhouse. And so then, well, if plants aren't responding to ratios, what are they responding to? And that's where he came with the sufficiency levels of available nutrients, which is most of what your universities, are utilizing right now. So just a little history there. Crop removal, pros and cons to that. I think maybe I covered most of that. CEC, pros and cons to that. Sufficiency level. This is kind of the system that we utilize for a couple of reasons. One, we're required to. If you're going to run a state-approved nutrient management plan, you're required to use the local university system. And so we use that system, but it's kind of a starting point, and then we kind of embellish it from there as however we see, whatever's suitable. But basically, I'll spend a little more time on this system. The pros and cons of this. It's based, let's just go to the next slide, because I want to not spend too much time on slides and keep it more for discussion. But let's go to where farmers are looking at interpreting the soil test, because that's ultimately where we need to go to. And what do the soil test ratings mean? The low, medium, and high. Low means because you got your phosphorus low, medium, and high, your potassium, those probably are 2 of the main ones, and also your trace minerals and basically everything. But if a soil test level winds up in the low category, it means that you've got a very strong likelihood of seeing a response by putting that nutrient on. Medium, it's very likely, but when you get into the high and very high range, you're probably not going to see a response by putting more of that nutrient on. That's what determines what's in the low category, medium category, and high category. And that is based on field research where they do, let's see, what do you call these? Correlation curves. So this is your soil test level, and this is your percentage of yield. And so let's say this is a Bray, probably a P1, so you get 10 parts per million, you get maybe 60% of your yield. But once you start to get up to maybe 25 to 30, you pretty much max your yield out on that nutrient. And here's one for potassium, different crops. But you'll see that is your parts per million of the nutrient, that once you start getting up to say 150, 175, there isn't much more yield response beyond that. And so that's where universities would say, well, we're not going to recommend any more from that. If you're into the crop removal system, it says, well, we also got to take into account that if you're raising alfalfa, removing 50, 60 pounds of potassium per ton, so if you're putting 5 ton on, that maybe we need to do more and above that. And then the farmer needs to determine, well, how much do I have invested in fertilizer to get a return on it? Here's a little better response, a slide to show that more generically. Very low, you can keep putting fertilizer on until you get to a certain point and it just levels off. Another way to look at it is if you're in a very low category, your soil has the capacity to maybe put on 30%, provide 30% of that nutrient. You need to supply the rest. If you're in a medium category, you need to supply about 60, 70%. The soil will supply 60, 70%. You need to supply the rest. And if you're in the very high range, the soil can supply it all. So that is considered to be a much more cost-effective means of fertilizing soil. This is just out of an extension bulletin, kind of showing the same thing. Very low, soil supplies this, you need to supply that, and you get to the low, to the medium, and you get to the high, in the very high range, and you probably won't see a yield response to adding more. What you'll find overall, at least what I've seen, is if you use, in my case, in the middle of Minnesota, University of Minnesota recommendations, you'll probably see your soil paths build and maintain themselves in the medium to maybe into the high, but you'll never get into the very high range. If you're working on something with taking the crop removal approach, they're always trying to get you up in that very high range. And as far as the economics of that, the reasonable approach would be that, well, when prices are tight, and fertilizer is expensive, keep it down here, but on the good years, put a little bit more on to get yourself up there so that you're not you don't have the potential to be sacrificing yield in those cases. So, and here's just one, since legumes are really important, I kept this one in. This is a yield response curve for alfalfa based on pH. Here, let's say we start with a 5 pH, first cutting 1,000 pounds of dry matter per acre, and we get that pH up to 7. We're probably like 35, as high as 4,000. So like we're tripling the amount of yield just because adjusting the pH. So that's something to keep in mind as well if you want to keep your legumes growing really strong. So, and pH is important because it affects mineral availability and biological activity, and usually we're shooting maybe a 6.5 to 7.0 ideally. Yeah, and that's a whole subject in and of itself. So sulfur, boy, this one has really been becoming an issue in the last 10 or 15 years. Atmospheric sulfur deposition. You remember acid rain? You don't hear much about that anymore. But this is just a shot of sulfur deposition. If you go in the Rust Belt, we were looking at 30 at 45 pounds per acre of sulfur coming in the rain every year. And across our region here, we were maybe to, let's say, maybe 8 to 12, maybe 15 pounds of sulfur. We didn't have to worry about sulfur too much. But this is another shot in 2012, and look how that sulfur has disappeared. And so we need to start adding sulfur into not all soils, but in many soils. We're seeing a real strong need for sulfur. And the sulfur soil test, and sulfur is an anion, it leaches through. When you interpret sulfur on a soil test, you look at the number, but you got to take some other things into account in order to make an accurate sulfur recommendation, unless it's high. Usually I find high sulfur levels, the first thing I'll want to inquire about if they've got any drainage issues. Because if they didn't have drainage issues, it would probably be escaping that soil profile. But anyway, and this was 2012, so that's like 10 years ago. And so it's probably even lower than that. So if you're putting together rotation and legumes are an important part of that, sulfur is going to be pretty important. And I always have this thing that I tell farmers that, the great thing about it's great we don't have acid rain anymore, but just think of it like this. When you get up in the morning and you step outside and you take a first breath of that cool, fresh, clean air, it's costing you about $20 an acre. So
Glenn, I have a couple of questions coming in. I didn't know if you wanted to continue on or
let's see what they are.
Herb is a member of our team and an organic grower that you've met virtually anyway. And he's asking if he has a soil pH of over 7. Is there an organic amendment that will help for increasing production? Their yields are typically below average. And then we have a comment that gypsum would be a good approach, or do you have thoughts on that or experience with that?
Elemental sulfur, it may not be very cost effective. It really depends upon how high the pH is and how strongly buffered that soil is. If you're looking at, hey, I really want to grow blueberries, well, then I'd say pull out all the stops and put on a lot of elemental sulfur to bring that down, but it's going to take time to do it. But I guess it depends upon how high it is. Because if you're looking at a 7.4, 7.4, 7.5, 7.6, the only advice I give to farmers is don't do anything to cause it to go any higher. In other words, don't put any limestone on it. He mentioned gypsum, but gypsum really doesn't have that much of an effect on soil pH, because a lot of people think, well, if I want to change my pH, then I use calcium, but it's really the carbonate in lime that moves your pH up. And in the case of gypsum, sure, it's calcium sulfate, but that sulfur is in the sulfate form, which is the form it needs to be available to the plant. But the acidification from sulfur occurs when you convert elemental sulfur to sulfate. That's when the acidification happens. If it's already in the sulfate form, that's not going to happen. So if he's got some, let's say he's got a 7.4 pH and he's got some production problems, I would look other places first before I'd start tackling that high pH. Think about how high it is. So any other questions?
Not right now, no.
Okay.
I encourage everyone to pop comments, questions in the chat box as we keep moving here.
Okay, steps that should be taken for fertilizer recommendation is made. It's always good to know where you're starting from. So get a soil test that manure or compost or whatever it is that you're using, particularly the material that you're importing, just to find out for sure. So you can determine what your needs are. And it's always good to have that starting point. Realistic yield goals and expectations. Well, if you're only producing 100, 125 bushels per acre corn, let's try to get you to 150 before we take you to 200. because so much of that just is simply management. It's the equipment that you're using. You know, it may take years to get that dialed in. Your soils, you may be starting at an extremely low fertility level, particularly if you're picking up some rented land that, let's say, was maybe in hay for the last 10 or 15 years. Oftentimes that can attest extremely low. You just kind of, you know, baby steps and just jack it up as your, you know, as things are able to improve. Calculate nutrient requirements, of course, based on soil tests and previous crop. And so you got to take into account your nitrogen cycling, because if you're coming out of alfalfa, if it's a good stand of alfalfa, there'll be a tremendous amount of nitrogen, maybe 150 pounds of nitrogen credit, let's say, going to corn. But there's also a second year credit coming from that. That can be 50 to 75 pounds per acre. And when you apply manure, not all of it comes available the first year. Some of it comes available the second year. So you calculate that stuff in as well. Okay, calculate nutrient credits from soil organic matter and previous legumes, manure, compost, 2-year history. I guess we just talked about that. And then once you do all your crediting and you subtract that from your nutrient requirements, and then whatever's left, wherever you're showing a nutrient deficiency at, that's what you build a fertility program around. Or at least that's our approach to it. Because the whole thing is that, you know, when you're working with farmers as an independent consultant, because we don't sell inputs, it's all about the farmer's net profitability, his bottom line. And so that's, you know, what you're really sifting to get to the bottom of. Soil sampling guidelines. Soil samples, your standard sample is 6 to 7 inches, unless you're going for maybe nitrates. You can go down 12 inches in some applications, 24 inches in others, and a few applications going down 48 inches, for instance, on sugar beets. Use a soil probe. Ideally, some people just go out with a spade and they collect it, and make sure that you're putting it in a clean container. I can't tell you how many times I had somebody come in one time and his copper were through the roof, and I called him up and I said, "You used a copper pipe to pull those probes, didn't you?" Sure enough, that's what he did. Had one farmer that sent me samples and the trace minerals were just all extremely high right across the board. And so I called him up. He said, "Well, I used a plastic bucket," but it was the plastic bucket that he used to feed the concentrate to his hogs. So we were picking stuff up from there. So if you're going out, you're doing a Z or a W pattern, you want 12 to 15 cores at least to vary out the variability. And there's more and more farmers going to grid sampling. That's kind of over and above this. We can have a whole discussion of the pros and cons of grid sampling with organic farmers. I don't think it makes as much sense for organic farmers, since generally our predominant input is manure, and we can't vary the NP and K in that anyway. So we don't have much use for BTR. Samples can be taken by field, soil type, or grid. Sample volume, if you're sending it to a lab, generally we tell people about a pint by volume or a pound, and that gives us enough to do what we need to do. And I think most of your laboratory bags are in that same range. And if soil samples are to be stored long-term, they should be dried immediately, air dried, or they should be frozen. Sometimes I get samples that come in and we have excessively high nitrate, nitrogen, and sulfur levels. And then you find out, well, you know, we had them stored in the porch for the last 3-4 months. We pulled them last fall, and now it's March. And the biology just keeps working. And so things start coming available. But I'd say mostly that affects nitrogen and sulfur levels. And then, of course, then you send an appropriate lab for analysis. And we could talk about that, because it's important that you have to understand what your requirements are. Let's say you're signing up for NRCS programs. They are required if you're doing nutrient management with them, they require that you use your state's nutrient recommendations, and those are specifically tied because they're calibrated off the specific soil test procedures that are prescribed in that state. In other words, you have fertilizer recommendations that are directly tied to a soil testing system. And within that soil testing system, you have the extract solutions. In Minnesota, we use ammonium acetate, Bray for phosphorus below 7.4, Olson for phosphorus above 7.4, DTPA for trace minerals, yada, yada, yada. If you move out to the East Coast, West Coast, I know Willie here, you must be with Board. I believe you're using a Malic 3. And so that's different. So as you get to the coast, the Malic 3 extract, and a lot of times they're pretty close, but they're not exactly the same. So, it's important to know what your requirements are. And the other thing too, is it's good to keep track of your soil tests from one cycle to another so that you compare the direction that you're going. I mean, I've often said it's more important to know the direction that your soil is going than it is to know what it is right now. Because if it's low, you should be moving it higher. If it's high, either leave it high or work it so it's coming down, so on and so forth. And so if you're constantly switching from one lab to the next, it's harder to make those comparisons. And it's just easier if you're consistently using the same lab. And it's not that you can't shop around. It's just something to be aware of. So I think that's kind of what I wanted to cover, just as a general, going over soil testing, things of that nature. And I just got some pretty pictures here. But let's just open it up.
You talked a little bit about some of these micronutrients, and one thing that I've been meaning to ask you for a long time, since you were kind of part of some of these ground floor discussions when, certifiers were trying to determine what regulations would apply to certified organic operations. And as an inspector, it always made me knit my eyebrows when we started talking about soil tests, because in organic, the only thing that, an inspector really has to ask about is, do you test for micronutrients? And if you're applying micronutrients, are they high? Why, do you know why that's such an emphasis in the regulation, when at the same time, I would look at their manure application rates and kind of be shocked at some of the levels being applied, as far as, nitrogen or even their phosphorus levels being super high. But, in organic, the only, big kind of deliberate conversation you can have from a certification standpoint is micronutrients. What's the background there? Do you know?
Yeah, because I was very early in those discussions, and the reason is that the trace minerals that we're using are considered synthetic, and they're restricted. There's approved, there's restricted, and there's prohibited. You can use restricted inputs as long as you have justification for using those. So if you're going to be using trace minerals, you need to have a soil test showing that you need them.
So like an example would be boron. Boron's typically from a synthetic, or it's synthetically derived, right? So that's kind of the nature of the whole restriction, and that's it.
Yeah, but this is where it really drives me batty crazy, is, how do you interpret, well, you mentioned boron, so let's talk about boron. A typical level, at least in our world, maybe we're going to shoot for maybe 1.5 parts per million on the soil test. There are other philosophies that say that should be 5 or 3. You can throw zinc in that category. You can throw copper. And so oftentimes I'll make these trace mineral recommendations. The certifier pushes back on the producer. And then I have to write a letter to the certifier stating why they're justified in using those trace minerals, which is not a problem. I've never had them come back at me, no, we think you're wrong.
Right.
They just need, it's kind of like a CYA, because certifiers certify farmers, but the NOP certifies certifiers. And so when it comes down to it, they just need to have that paper trail that, yeah, we addressed it. We had this expert say it was fine, so we're just kind of moving that on him or her. And that usually takes care of it. But the thing that I get concerned with is, oh my gosh, you got high trace mineral levels. And they look at that low, medium, and high category. And they think that very high means toxic. And, the toxicity level for, let's say, copper might be 15, 20, 25 parts per million. I don't even know for sure, because I've never seen anybody push it up that high to where we saw toxic levels. But at some point, it could become toxic. But what I always emphasize is just because you got something that's in the high or the very high range does not mean it's toxic. What that means is it's a waste of money to put more on. And between that and it being toxic is, it's a much higher level. So I always try to stress that to certifiers or the people on the review committees that are reviewing these, that very high does not mean toxic in a soil test interpretation scenario.
Well, and we've had these conversations before where, my sincere hope is that with more organic inspector trainings, we have these discussions about, when is a manure application rate a little bit of a concern? Because I think I was always the first organic inspector that would ask these questions on some of my inspections, and they were always kind of surprised that I, knew something and asked about it. So I think there's a little bit of a knowledge gap in some of the training that's out there, because there is regulation on, preventing runoff, preventing natural resource concerns, but you still have to connect the dots. So anyway, I don't want to do too much of a diversion here. I know you have some great slides on kind of soil dynamics and how it relates to weed control issues. So
yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it is an excellent question, because nobody's certified really addresses over application of, let's say, like a manure.
Not unless the inspector specifically raises a concern.
Yeah, or if they're trained in it. Just most people just aren't trained in it, just to know what is too much. Because is it organic to be putting twice as much liquid dairy on a farm where you probably have 100 pounds of excess nitrogen leaching into the groundwater out the tile line? I wouldn't consider that within the organic framework of being great for the environment. And there may be cases where that's happening. I'd say in our current situation, over application of manure is kind of expensive, so farmers don't want to do it anyway. But yeah, it's a great question. We overemphasize some things, and bigger dangers and concerns we're looking the other way. So, but basically, when you've got your cropping system, your cropping rotation, you're dodging the insects, you're dodging the weeds the best you can, you're breaking up weed cycles, insect cycles, disease cycles. These are all pictures taken from organic farms that we work with, over the years. And now, granted, I cherry pick these, trust me. We could do a whole session on just total and complete disasters as well. But, when things are really going your way, like here we've got, 209 bushel of corn on the bottom left, 215 bushel corn. And above that, we got good weed control. I love this picture because that's where that flamer row went out. And you can see the difference in weed control. Notice that the unflamed corn is a little bit taller and a little bit darker green, and that's typically what you see. But give this a month and you won't find this corn back, where this stuff will be looking just as good as this. So just another field, 205 bushel per acre. Keep in mind, this is Minnesota stuff. So that's pretty exceptional for us. May not be if you're in Nebraska or Illinois or maybe Southern Iowa. We do a lot with diversifying, like interseeding crops. Like this is a field that I had, and this is barley and peas. 1.5 bushel of barley, 2.5 bushel of peas. And if you do it right, it looks more like a pea field rather than a barley field. And the trick is to not put any nitrogen on. So, you know, we probably did 25 bushel per acre barley here, because that's all the nitrogen was for. But we did, you know, 50 bushel per acre peas. So anyway, this is crowds out weeds, just does a really good job. The only problem that you have is you have an extremely wet year. Those peas will disappear from disease. Then you wind up at 25 bushel per acre barley, and that's not very profitable. So there's a lot of things that can go wrong with these systems. And this is rye and soybeans. This is stuff that we did before they invented the roller crimper. And I don't even know if I'm a fan of the roller crimper for all practical purposes, for the amount of stuff that we've seen, good results we've seen not using the roller crimper. But essentially, this was a field that we planted in boot stage of the rye. We clipped the heads off when it was in the milk stage, and this is how that field turned out. This is over by Evansville, Minnesota. This is north of Moorhead. And what I like about this picture is, again, the soybeans were planted at boot stage in the rye, and it was I think it was bat wing mowed off. But this was kind of a bit of a drainage ditch that did not have rye the fall before. So there was no rye planted there. And of course, you're seeing a lot of mustard come through. So just an idea of the allelopathy from rye. And then, you know, then there's when things go wrong. This is a fun little shot. This is where the guy forgot to turn his spinners on, his spreader. Interestingly enough, there was no nitrogen in there. That's probably a sulfur response. So that's the importance of sulfur. But, you know, here we got probably just completely weeds taken over. But if you've got a well laid out system, you should be able to avoid these. Now this is a real interesting shot of chicken manure pellets, another case where they forgot to turn the spinner on. And so they immediately were concerned that they that there's weed seed in the fertilizer. And that wasn't really the case, because this just happens to be when you over apply nutrients, that the weeds capitalize on those nutrients much more aggressively than what the crop will. So it's important not to over fertilize your plants. Weeds, on the other hand, will survive better than the crops in low fertility situations. So, you know, you need to have the right amount on to get the best results. So anyway, I guess we can quit there. So just open up for general questions.
Well, back to your, you had that one slide on flame weeding, you know, and I think we're still 100% refining our understanding of, you know, how flame weeding can be effective in organic systems and perfecting the technology too. But Herb had another question here. Have you seen yield losses from flame weeding? And in your kind of field experience, what's the best stage of growth to do it? Or is there such a thing? And my question actually with this slide was going to be, did they do any pre-emergent flame weeding for those broadleaves? And do you think that would have done a better job? Or is that why it was effective, I guess?
The way we've fine-tuned flaming, because when I think of flaming, I go back to Ray O'Keel and his two brothers that basically hacked these out of old grows and start putting together. Then his neighbor Denny Lutke said, hey, you know, I'm going to build me one. And then, you know, that went from farmer to farmer. So we wound up building a lot of flamers. Originally, what we did, it was just a tool that was used, let's say after the corn was between knee and waist high, you would go in and you would clean it up. Then I think Danny came up with the concept of flame the corn when it's young and go over the top of it. And that was pretty scary for farmers to do. It was pretty scary to me to recommend, because believe me, the last thing I want to do is recommend a practice where a farmer fails, because I typically get fired after things like that. So I'm pretty sensitive to that. You don't want to be giving out bad information, but ultimately we would go into, a corn maybe a little bit younger than this, and then we would flame over the top, the corn and all, and just take it all out. And what you wind up with just like a stump of a corn plant. But if you come back the next day, you'll see how much it grew, just because of the, how much green is coming out of that shoot. The most important thing, have I ever seen corn being killed? I mean, I've seen corn being set back, but the only time you're going to see corn being killed is when you have a compromised root system. If you have root disease, or if you have insect damage. And oftentimes they go together. So if your root system is just a mess, it's not going to fare very well. It's all the plant's ability. It's all about the plant's ability to rebound from that. And the next thing is that you want the plant to fully recover before you come back out there again to reflame. There was a time, and every once in a while I still hear it, that I was under the impression that, well, they just go across it and you're not going to completely kill it. And so, but you'll wilt it. So turn around a few days and come back and do it again. That was bad information. And if there's anybody out there that's still quoting me saying that, please stop, because, we've learned, we've moved on. You can really set the corn back if you come in too soon, even if you come in the same day, people have told me. So what you're better off doing is don't take any chances. Turn the heat up and make sure you get the job done, the first time. Because the last thing you want is weeds that you've only half killed, and a corn plant that you've really stressed. And now this stressed corn plant has to compete with those weeds that are recovering. And then you probably have done more damage than good. I mean, we've gone in situations where, the corn was maybe 10 inches tall, 10 inches tall, and the pigweed and lamb's quarter were 2/3 as high as the corn was. And the question is, well, do we flame it, or do we just go and get the disc and start over? First rule of organic farming, this is my quote: leave the disc parked at the end of the field in case you need to start over. But generally that doesn't happen too often. But in that particular case, what we did, 1.5 miles an hour and 50 pounds of pressure. And that field yielded 175 bushel per acre corn and hardly weed in it. I mean, it just did a fantastic job of cleaning it up. I mean, it's probably, I generally don't talk about flamers being a rescue tool, but in that case, it did work that way. And farmers are afraid to do that. You can't put too much heat on the corn. Well, it's about killing the weeds, and that's what your primary focus has to be. And we've had farmers extremely successful and very, very clean fields as a result of that.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. Well, if there's any other questions, I'm just here monitoring the chat box. Otherwise, Glenn, I can pepper you with some of those questions we talked about earlier if you don't have more slides. I think, I'm curious if you have seen a commonality with, growers that are looking at soil test results, whether they're from your lab or other labs. What's the most common thing you see growers kind of miss or gloss over when they're looking at their soil test reports?
I would say you have such a broad range of perspectives. You'd be surprised how many farmers just simply don't do them. They don't believe in them. And a lot of that can be probably tied to having bad experience with people using soil tests to, you know, as a tool to talk them into one thing or another. You have to keep in mind that soil test is a technology that isn't perfect. I mean, it's got its strengths and its weaknesses. And so you can't be too literal with them. But it's kind of the best tool we have. And, you know, things develop as we move forward, different extract solutions, but they do a pretty good job in most cases. There are some soil types that can that can really throw you where, you know, they just got some other issues. It might be drainage, it may be low rainfall, but as far as getting back to your initial questions, there's a lot of farmers that don't believe in them, they don't trust them, but really it comes down to interpretation. They just simply don't know how to interpret them. And I would say if you're finding yourself where if you don't know how to interpret them, you're probably just as well off without them, or at least find somebody that you can trust to interpret them for you. So, and they can be confusing. You know, I look at a soil test and bam, 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 I know exactly what I'm looking at. But if I'm looking at a feed analysis test, I'm calling my buddy who's an animal nutritionist to help me figure those out. So
and
it can be challenging.
From my experience, you know, before I was an organic inspector, I was a feedlot inspector. And so, as you know, I've spent a lot of time looking at, you know, soil tests and manure analyses, and it continues to amaze me the sort of diversity of how these tests are laid out, the graphics, the colors, the arrows.
Yeah.
Do you think, or have you ever seen a soil test where you looked at it and you thought, you know, this is kind of skewing the interpretation of it, or it might be influencing the grower's interpretation of it a certain way? Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely go along with that, but maybe not so much from soil testing labs themselves, because sometimes companies will take the data and they'll put it on their own format to kind of suit their own program and their own purposes. I'd say that would be more true with those. But I think if you look at how soil test reports are laid out, they're really designed by perhaps soil scientists. And they're putting together what logically makes sense for them. Unfortunately, let's say if you're a farmer that's not PhD in soil science, that may not make sense to you. So, but once you're using a lab and you stick with them, you kind of get familiar with where the numbers are and hopefully what they mean. Because I still have that issue where I'll get a soil test report that I'm not used to, that someone sends me to interpret, and I just, okay, where's the pH? Like, way down here, what's it doing down here for? You know, and so it takes me a little bit to navigate them sometimes, but I think, you know, you kind of get over that. So, you know, it's just different logic that's being applied. So.
Well, I thought I'd just get us started to wrap up here. I just wanted to mention, you know, we did our farm team summit back at the beginning of March, and yours truly is slowly but surely editing and going to be making recordings of those sessions available on our YouTube page. So if you check out Organic Farm Team on YouTube, you'll start seeing some of those. Of course, we record all the episodes of Fridays on the Farm and post them there. So go ahead and like and subscribe what we got going on there. Actually, at the end of April, we are going to feature one of the recordings from that with our friends Nick Podol from the Rodale Institute, Danny Kusner from the Andersons, and Drew Foster from our team. And we'll actually have Nick and Drew joining live for that session. I'm really excited to have Nick join us. And I actually just talked with him the other day, and he said, well, I have an interview with the No-Till Farmer podcast right before that, so I might be late. So kind of a neat deal for them. Again, my name's May. Definitely reach out to me with comments, questions, ideas, complaints, compliments. on our Fridays on the Farm episodes. And if you have anybody you think would be interested in sharing with us, we're definitely always looking for good content, just like our friend Glenn. So Glenn, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yep, enjoyed being here. This was fun.
You can find AgResource Consulting online, and Glenn's contact information is there. I think he threw it up at the very beginning as well. If you wanted to share that again, you'd be welcome to, Glenn.
Let me see. There would be, I suppose I don't have it up yet, or is it on the screen?
Not yet.
Okay, I have to.
But I was coaching Glenn the other day on his website and you can Google AgResource Consulting and they will pop up in your email, and the office phone number is up there for sure.
It's bad need of updating, but it's not my forte.
That's how it goes.
And I just need to perhaps make it my forte. So no, I'm kind of lost here. So
all right, Glenn, well, thanks. I think we'll just go ahead and wrap it up for today.
There I am. Okay.
Everyone have a great weekend.
Okay.
Thanks.